Give them any color they want so long as it's black. That's a famous quote about the Model T, the first mass-produced automobile. And it was made by one of the great industrialists and worst marketers in history, the legendary Henry Ford. Today, of course, the only place an only black color scheme might survive is in the funeral business. And it's not just the colors of a product that people make their choices on. It's also a dizzying array of variations based on size, weight, shape, materials, levels of service, warranties, and so on. The question, of course, is how do consumers go about making their choices? And the concept of individual choice is one of the most important in economics. In fact, the great economist Stanley Jevons once said, "The theory of economics must begin with a correct theory of consumption." So, why do people do what they do? While psychologists and philosophers have many complex answers to that question, economists believe that for the most part, we do what we do and we buy what we buy because it makes us feel good. And while some may argue that this selfish rationale lacks any of the milk of human kindness that sets humans apart from the apes, it is nonetheless hard to disagree with the idea that a lot of our behavior is indeed driven by self-interest. Using this simple method of self-interest, consumer choice boils down to three things: the pleasure people get from consuming a good or service, the price they have to pay for that good or service, and the income or budget available to them to exercise their choices. So, how do we measure pleasure? It's a good question, and the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham and his followers thought they had an answer back in the 1800s. Bentham proposed that society should be organized on the principle of utility, which he defined as the property in any object to produce pleasure or happiness, or to prevent pain or unhappiness. To Bentham, all legislation should be designed on utilitarian principles to promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And Bentham's followers took him quite literally. They believed that scientists would eventually invent a machine that could measure pleasure by measuring brainwaves. These Benthamites even developed a measure of pleasure they called the udel. For example, a big, juicy sirloin steak for dinner might give a person 1,000 udels, while a plate of lowly Spam might yield only 100 udels. Now here's the broader point, and our first key definition of the lesson. If economists were in fact able to take such precise measures of pleasure with some utilimeter, they'd have what is called a cardinal measure of utility. With cardinal utility, the consumer's satisfaction can be measured in actual numbers, and that would make it very easy to explain consumer behavior. Of course, nobody yet has come up with a utilometer. Instead, in their efforts to explain consumer choice, economists have settled for an ordinal measure of utility. That's our next key definition. An ordinal measure of utility simply ranks goods relative to one another. Thus, you can say you like broccoli, and you can say you like peas more than broccoli, and you can say that you like ice cream better than both of those vegetables. But you don't really need to say by how much in order to rank your preferences for those goods. That's ordinal utility. Now, having debunked the existence of a cardinal utility, it will nonetheless be very convenient for me to now assume that we can, in fact, use actual numbers to measure utility. This is a favorite trick of economists. Make a simplifying assumption to explain a complex point. In this case, I'm going to first explain the difference between total utility and marginal utility. I will then show you how the so-called utility maximizing rule, or equimarginal principle, allows us to derive the downward sloping demand curve. But just remember, as I do this, that our use of actual numbers is only for simplicity. Now, before we get on with all of that, here's a brief digression on an important word, the word marginal. This word plays a huge role in the study of microeconomics, and it is a word we put before all sorts of other words. So we have marginal utility, marginal cost, marginal benefit, and so on. Basically, in an economic context, marginal measures the change in one thing that occurs with a one-unit change in another thing. Let me show you what I mean in the context of total versus marginal utility. So take a look at this table. It first shows the quantity of music concerts consumed, Q. It also shows the total pleasure or utility, U, that Johann, our music connoisseur, would gain from that consumption. Note that as consumption increases from 0 to 5, utility increases from 0 to 10. Now, let's use this table to derive the marginal utility, where the marginal utility is simply the additional utility that Johann would derive from a one-unit increase in consumption. So to start, here's a question. If Johann moves from 0 to 1 concert and total utility increases from 0 to 4, what's Johann's marginal utility? That's right, it's 4. Now, how about if Johann increases his consumption by one more concert to 2? What is the marginal utility now? That's right, the answer is 3, which we get by subtracting 4 from 7. Now please take a minute to fill in the marginal utilities in the rest of the table. And please take the time to do this if you can. The tendency will be to just power on, but if you do these little interactive exercises, you will actually learn a lot more. So pause the presentation now if you have the time, and then just hit the playback button when you are ready to check your answer. Did you get it right? Note that in this third column, the marginal utility steadily falls as consumption rises. This reflects the law of diminishing marginal utility, and it is one of the most important concepts in economics. Think about it this way. Suppose you go to a restaurant and have duck orange with wild rice. It might taste pretty good, and you might even be hungry after eating. Even so, if the waiter brings a second serving of the duck, it probably won't taste as good as the first. And if you had to eat a third serving, it probably wouldn't taste very good at all. Apparently, sometimes you really can get too much of a good thing. Now here's another table. This one represents the utility associated with eating pizza slices. Take a minute now to graph on a piece of paper or draw on your computer tablet both the total utility and marginal utility curves with the quantity of pizza on the horizontal axis. To do this, just pause the presentation now and give it a spin. Do your figures look like these? Note that the downward slope of the marginal utility curve in the right-hand figure is reflected in the total utility curve being bowed downward in the left-hand figure. This bowed shape in turn reflects the idea that total utility increases with consumption but does so at a decreasing rate. In other words, there is diminishing marginal utility. Okay, that's some good stuff so far. When you're ready, please move on to Module 3 of this lesson.